Millionaire sees a beggar with a baby in the rain and risks giving her the keys to his house. When he came back, his life was never the same. 41 floors above the city that never sleeps, Elliot Dane stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows, watching raindrops race down the glass like tears he'd forgotten how to shed. The penthouse around him gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy. Italian marble, custom furniture, awards lining the walls, tech innovator of the year, entrepreneur of the decade, philanthropist of tomorrow. Each one a monument to his success, and a reminder of everything he'd sacrificed to get here. The charity gala had ended an hour ago. Another evening of handshakes and hollow smiles, of people who wanted something from him, who saw dollar signs when they looked into his eyes. Elliot had written checks that would change lives, posed for photos that would grace magazine covers, and felt absolutely nothing. Nothing at all. He loosened his black tie, the silk slipping through his fingers like time itself. When was the last time he'd felt anything real? When was the last time someone had looked at him and seen just Elliot? The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the windows with an urgency that matched the restlessness in his chest. His reflection stared back at him, successful, wealthy, admired, and utterly, completely alone. He moved through his pristine home like a ghost haunting his own life. The dining table, set for one. The second bedroom that had never been used. The silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing down on him like the judgment of all the choices that had brought him here. Elliot grabbed his coat. He couldn't stay in this beautiful prison tonight. The storm hit him the moment he stepped outside. Cold rain sliced through the warm spring air, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected neon and broken dreams. Most people hurried past with umbrellas and purpose, but Elliot walked slowly, letting the rain soak through his expensive suit. He needed to feel something. Anything. That's when he saw her. Huddled under a bus stop canopy that had lost half its roof to the wind, a woman sat with her back against the metal frame. Her clothes were soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her head, but it was what she held that stopped Elliot's heart cold. A baby, maybe 6 months old. Wrapped in what looked like a hospital blanket that had seen better days, the infant was pressed against her chest, both of them shivering in the merciless rain. People walked past, dozens of them. They glanced, maybe frowned with mild concern, then hurried on with their lives. But something about the woman's stillness, the way she curved her entire body around that baby like a shield, jolted something awake in Elliot's chest. He watched her for a moment that felt like eternity. She wasn't begging, wasn't asking for anything. She was just surviving, protecting the most precious thing in her world with nothing but her own body against the storm. Without thinking, without planning, without considering the consequences, Elliot walked over. The woman looked up when his shadow fell across her. Her eyes were the color of dark honey, wide with the kind of wariness that came from too much pain, too much disappointment. She pulled the baby closer, as if expecting him to hurt them somehow. "It's okay," Elliot said quietly, his voice nearly lost in the rain. "I'm not. I don't want anything." He pulled out his wallet, then stopped. Money felt wrong somehow. Inadequate, like putting a Band-Aid on a severed artery. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his house keys. The weight of them in his palm felt heavier than usual. Then he pulled out his business card, the rain already starting to blur the expensive ink. The woman stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. "My address is on the card," he said, pressing both into her trembling hand. "It's warm. There's food. I'll be gone for a week. Business trip. Use it. Please." She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The baby made a soft sound, and she looked down, then back up at Elliot with something that might have been hope fighting against disbelief. I can't," she whispered. "You can," Elliot said simply. "You should. For him." He nodded toward the baby, whose tiny fist had emerged from the blanket. "There's a doorman named Marcus. Tell him Elliot said you could stay." Before she could protest, before he could change his mind, before the rational part of his brain could talk him out of the most impulsive decision of his carefully controlled life, Elliot turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because something in those honey-colored eyes had cracked open a part of himself he'd thought was sealed forever. The part that remembered what it felt like to care about someone other than himself. The part that remembered his sister. As he disappeared into the storm, Elliot didn't know that he'd just handed his house keys to the woman who would save his life. He only knew that for the first time in years, walking away from his penthouse felt less like leaving home and more like finally heading toward it. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean and carrying with it the echo of a choice that would change everything. 7 days later, Elliot stood outside his own front door with his key in his hand and no idea what he'd find on the other side. The business trip to Seattle had been successful. Another acquisition, another company folded into his empire, another few million added to accounts that were already overflowing. But for 7 days, he'd thought about honey-colored eyes and a baby's cry lost in the rain. He'd wondered if she'd even used his keys, or if she'd been too proud, too scared, too smart to trust a stranger's kindness. He'd wondered if he'd been too late. The lock turned easily, and the door swung open to reveal his home. But different. Subtly, inexplicably different. The air smelled like vanilla and something else, something warm and lived in that his sterile penthouse had never possessed. His Italian leather shoes, usually lined up with military precision by the door, sat next to a pair of worn women's sneakers that had been carefully cleaned despite their obvious age. "Hello," he called softly. A woman's voice drifted from the kitchen. "Just a minute." Elliot set down his suitcase and walked deeper into his transformed home. The living room looked the same at first glance, but then he noticed the details. A throw pillow that had been perfectly positioned for months was now actually used, bearing the impression of someone's head. The coffee table had a ring where a mug had sat. Real life had touched his museum-perfect space. And on the floor, near the window where the afternoon light pooled warm and golden, sat toys. Not expensive, store-bought toys, but creations of pure imagination. Paper towel tubes transformed into rockets, old socks turned into puppets, a cardboard box decorated with crayon drawings that looked like they might be attempting to be clouds. "Mr. Dane." He turned to find her standing in the kitchen doorway, and the breath caught in his throat. Clean and dry, she was beautiful in the way that real things were beautiful, not perfect, but genuine. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a sweater that looked like they'd been washed carefully by hand. But it was her expression that hit him hardest. Shame and gratitude and fear all tangled together in those honey-colored eyes. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. I cleaned everything. I changed the sheets back. I was about to leave. I just wanted to." She gestured helplessly toward the kitchen. "I made dinner. To say thank you. But I can go, I'll just get." "Stop," Elliot said gently. "Please. Just stop." She froze, and in the silence, a soft giggling sound came from the kitchen. Baby laughter, bright and musical and completely foreign to these walls. "That's Benji," she said, and for the first time, she almost smiled. He likes it here. The light from the windows. He's never had so much space to." She cut herself off, as if admitting happiness was somehow wrong. Elliot walked past her into the kitchen and stopped short. The baby, Benji, sat in an improvised high chair made from cushions and a regular chair, gumming a piece of toast and looking up at Elliot with curious, bright eyes. When he saw him, the baby's face broke into a gummy grin, and he reached out with tiny, jam-sticky fingers. "He remembers you," the woman said softly from behind him. "From that night. He cried for hours after you left, like he was looking for you." Something twisted in Elliot's chest. He looked around the kitchen and realized what felt so different. It had been used. Really used. There were dishes drying by the sink. Not his usual solitary plate and fork, but bowls and spoons and a sippy cup. The stovetop showed signs of actual cooking. There was life here. "What's your name?" he asked, not turning around. "Lila," she said quietly. "Lila Chun. And I know what you're thinking." "Do you?" He turned to face her. "Because I'm thinking that my kitchen has never smelled this good. I'm thinking that the squeaky door in the hallway isn't squeaking anymore. I'm thinking that this is the first time in 5 years that my home has felt like more than just an expensive place to sleep." Her mouth opened, then closed. Benji babbled happily from his makeshift throne, as if adding his own commentary to the conversation. "I also noticed," Elliot continued, "that you cleaned things I forgot were dirty, that you fixed things I'd stopped hearing, that you took care of a place that isn't yours like it mattered to you." Tears gathered in Lila's eyes. "It did matter. It saved us. You saved us. I can never." "Where were you planning to go?" The question came out rougher than he'd intended. "When you left here, Where would you have taken him? Lila looked down at her hands. There's a shelter across town. They said they might have space next week. Might. Yes. Elliot looked at Benji, who was now trying to stuff his entire fist in his mouth, then back at Lila. What if you didn't have to go? Her head snapped up. What? What if you stayed? Just until you get back on your feet. I travel a lot for work. The place is empty most of the time anyway. He paused, trying to find words for something he didn't entirely understand himself. It's better with you in it. I can't accept that, Lila said quickly. I can't take advantage of. You're not taking advantage of anything, Elliot said firmly. You're giving me something I didn't know I needed. Which is, he looked around his transformed kitchen, at the signs of real life that had bloomed in his sterile space, at the baby who grinned at him like sunshine. A reason to come home. Lila stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for something, sincerity, maybe, or signs of ulterior motives. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because her shoulders relaxed just a fraction. Just until I get back on my feet, she said softly. Just until then. Elliot agreed, though something in his chest whispered that he hoped that day would be a very long time coming. Benji chose that moment to throw his toast, which landed with a wet splat on Elliot's expensive suit. Instead of being annoyed, Elliot found himself laughing. Actually laughing, for the first time in months. And as Lila rushed to clean up the mess, apologizing profusely while Benji clapped his hands in delight at the chaos he'd caused, Elliot realized something that should have terrified him. His empty penthouse had become home the moment she'd walked into it. He just didn't know yet how much that was going to cost him. 3 weeks had passed since Lila and Benji had turned Elliot's sterile penthouse into something that felt dangerously close to home. 3 weeks of morning coffee that actually tasted like more than fuel. 3 weeks of coming back from meetings to find hand-drawn pictures stuck to his refrigerator with magnets he'd never owned. 3 weeks of Benji's delighted squeals echoing through halls that had known only silence for years. And 3 weeks of watching Lila flinch every time his phone rang. Mr. Dane, we need to talk. Marianne Walsh had been Elliot's assistant for 8 years. She'd seen him through hostile takeovers, media scandals, and board meetings that would have broken lesser men. Nothing rattled her. But today, standing in his office doorway with a tablet clutched against her chest like armor, she looked genuinely worried. What is it, Marianne? She closed the door behind her and sat down across from his desk. It's about your house guest. Something cold settled in Elliot's stomach. What about her? I did some digging. Background checks. You know, standard procedure when someone has access to your home. Marianne's fingers tapped nervously against her tablet. Elliot, you barely know this woman. Lila Chun has no credit history before 2 years ago. No employment records. No address. It's like she didn't exist before 2022. People start over, Marianne. Maybe she had reasons. What reasons would make someone completely erase their past? Marianne leaned forward. And there's something else. I found a police report from Denver. Domestic disturbance call. The victim refused to press charges, but the description matches her perfectly. Dark hair, 5'6", scar on her left wrist. Elliot's hand tightened around his pen. He'd noticed that scar. A thin white line that Lila unconsciously covered whenever she was nervous. You think she's running from someone? I think she's running from someone dangerous. Marianne's voice was gentle but firm. And I think she's brought that danger into your life. That evening, Elliot found himself studying Lila in a way he never had before. She sat on his couch, Benji asleep in her arms, watching the sunset paint the city in shades of gold and amber. She looked peaceful, safe. But now he could see what he'd missed before. The way her eyes constantly flickered to the windows, the way she jumped at unexpected sounds, the way she positioned herself so she could always see the exits. Lila, he said softly, settling beside her on the couch. Can I ask you something? Her body tensed immediately. Of course. Where did you come from? Before that night in the rain, where were you? The change in her was instant and heartbreaking. Her face went pale, her arms tightened around Benji, and those honey-colored eyes filled with something that looked like panic. Why? The word came out sharp, defensive. Why does it matter? Because I care about you. Both of you. And I can see that you're scared of something. Lila stood abruptly, nearly jostling Benji awake. You don't understand. You couldn't possibly understand. Then help me understand. She turned to face him, and Elliot was shocked by the raw pain in her expression. You want to know where I came from? I came from a place where people like you don't exist, where kindness comes with a price, where trust gets you hurt, where the only way to survive is to run and keep running until you find somewhere safe enough to stop. You're safe here. Am I? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You live in a world where problems get solved with money and influence, where people do what you want because you pay them to. You don't know what it's like to have everything taken from you, to have someone convince you that you're worthless, that you deserve the pain, that no one will ever believe you if you try to leave. The words hung between them like broken glass. Elliot wanted to reach for her, to offer comfort, but something in her posture warned him to stay back. You don't know what it's like, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. To love someone so much that you'd rather live in fear than risk them getting hurt because of you. She turned and walked toward the bedroom, Benji still sleeping in her arms. At the doorway, she paused without looking back. I'll find somewhere else to go. Tomorrow. I should have left weeks ago. Lila, wait. But she was already gone, leaving Elliot alone with the weight of her words and the terrible understanding of what they meant. That night, sleep eluded him. He paced his apartment, replaying the conversation, trying to piece together the fragments of her story. It was past midnight when he heard Benji crying. Not his usual fussy cry, but the sharp wail of real distress. Elliot padded down the hall and found Lila's door slightly ajar. Through the gap, he could see her sitting on the edge of the bed, rocking Benji and crying silently. Her shoulders shook with the effort of keeping her sobs quiet. He was about to knock when something on the floor caught his eye. A torn photograph, partially hidden under the edge of the bed. Without thinking, he reached down and picked it up. The image hit him like a physical blow. Lila, but younger, thinner, with a bruise blooming purple across her left cheek. She was holding Benji, who looked maybe 2 months old. And beside her, with his face violently scratched out with what looked like keys or fingernails, was a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with thick arms and hands that looked capable of terrible things. On the back, in Lila's careful handwriting, Denver General Hospital, Benji's birth certificate. Fresh start. Elliot's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph. This wasn't just someone running from a bad relationship. This was someone running for her life. He looked up to find Lila standing in the doorway, her face white with horror. You weren't supposed to see that, she whispered. Lila, now you know. Her voice was hollow, defeated. Now you know what kind of person you let into your home. What kind of danger you're in just by being near us. Elliot stood slowly, still holding the torn photograph. What I know is that you're one of the bravest people I've ever met. She stared at him in disbelief. You protected your son. You got him out. You survived. His voice caught. And you're still surviving. Still protecting him. Still being the mother he needs, even when you're terrified. You don't understand the kind of man he is, she said desperately. What he's capable of. If he finds us, then we'll deal with it. Together. There is no we in this, Elliot. There can't be. I won't let my problems destroy your life. But as she reached for the photograph, Elliot pulled it back. Not to keep it from her, but to look at it again. To memorize the face that had been scratched out. To burn into his memory the evidence of what this man had done to her. What's his name? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. Lila closed her eyes. Marcus. Marcus Webb. And he's not the kind of man who lets go of what he thinks belongs to him. As she took the photograph and retreated back into her room, Elliot stood in the hallway with a growing certainty that this was about to become more complicated than either of them could imagine. Because for the first time in his adult life, he'd found something worth protecting. And he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take it away. The job offer came on a Thursday morning over breakfast that had become their quiet ritual. I want you to work for me, Elliot said, setting down his coffee cup with the kind of careful precision that meant he'd been thinking about this for a while. Lila looked up from feeding Benji pieces of banana, her expression immediately wary. Elliot, hear me out. He leaned forward, his eyes bright with the same intensity that had built his empire. I have a foundation. The Dane Foundation. We fund programs for families in crisis, but we've never had someone with real experience running the day-to-day operations. Someone who understands what it's actually like to need help. I don't have a college degree. I don't have experience managing. You have something more valuable than either of those things. You have heart. You have perspective. And you have the ability to see people who are invisible to everyone else. Benji banged his spoon against his high chair, as if adding his own opinion to the conversation. Lila wiped Banana from his chin with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to do everything one-handed. Why? She asked quietly. Why are you doing this? The question hung between them, loaded with all the things they hadn't said, all the careful boundaries they'd built around this strange arrangement that had become something neither of them knew how to name. Because, Elliot said finally, you make me want to be better than I am. It was the closest thing to a confession either of them had offered, and it settled over the breakfast table like morning light, warm, revealing, and impossible to ignore. 2 weeks later, Lila Chun was officially employed by the Dane Foundation, with a salary that made her cry in the bathroom of the downtown office building, and a sense of purpose she'd thought she'd lost forever. The work suited her in ways that surprised them both. She had an instinct for finding the families who needed help most, the ones who'd fallen through the cracks of other programs. She could spot desperation disguised as pride, recognize the particular exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. And slowly, carefully, she began to bloom. Elliot watched the transformation with something that felt dangerously close to pride. The nervous, watchful woman who'd lived in his guest room was becoming someone confident, someone who laughed at Benji's antics without looking over her shoulder, someone who met his eyes across the dinner table without flinching. For 2 months, it felt like they were building something real, something that might last. Then the photos surfaced. Sir, Marcus, the doorman, handed Elliot a manila envelope as he entered the building. This was left for you. No return address. Elliot's blood turned to ice before he even opened it. Inside were glossy photographs. Him and Lila leaving the foundation office together. Him carrying Benji through the lobby of his building. The three of them at the park, looking for all the world like a family. And attached to each photo was a printed article from a gossip website. Tech Mobile's Mystery Woman. Gold Digger or True Love? The story was vicious in its speculation. It painted Lila as a calculating opportunist who'd seduced a lonely millionaire, implied that Benji might not even be her child, suggested that the whole thing was an elaborate con game. But it was the comments section that made Elliot's hands shake with rage. Strangers on the internet dissecting Lila's appearance, her background, her worthiness. People who'd never struggled for anything in their lives calling her a leech, a fraud, a whore. He found her in his apartment that evening, sitting on the couch with Benji in her lap, staring at her laptop screen with tears streaming down her face. Lila, I have to go. She didn't look up from the screen. Tonight, before this gets worse. No. The word came out harder than he'd intended. No, you're not running because some gossip website published lies. They're not all lies though, are they? She finally looked at him, and the pain in her eyes was devastating. I am living in your apartment. I am working for your foundation. I did meet you when I had nothing and nowhere to go. Maybe I am taking advantage. Stop. Elliot crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. Look at me. Really look at me. She did, reluctantly. Do I look like someone who can be taken advantage of? Do I look like someone who makes decisions without thinking them through? No, but then trust me when I tell you that everything I've given you, I've given freely. Because I wanted to. Because you and Benji make my life better in ways I can't even explain. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. They'll never leave us alone now. There will always be speculation, gossip, people watching our every move. Then we'll deal with it. Together. Why? The question was barely a whisper. Why are you willing to go through this for us? Elliot had been asking himself the same question for weeks. Why had he given his keys to a stranger? Why had he invited her to stay? Why was he willing to fight the whole world to protect something he barely understood? Because, he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected, you gave me shelter too. In that storm, when I handed you my keys, I was drowning. And you saved me without even knowing it. Before she could respond, a sound from the hallway made them both freeze. A slow, deliberate knock on the door. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more knocks. Lila went rigid in his arms. He's here, she whispered. Oh God, he found us. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. And in that moment, as Elliot looked at the woman who'd become his whole world and the baby who called him E, with pure joy, he realized that everything, the photos, the articles, the exposure, had been leading to this. Someone had been watching them. Someone had been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now that moment had arrived. The knocking stopped, but they both knew it wasn't over. It was just beginning. As Elliot reached for his phone to call security, as Lila clutched Benji closer to her chest, as the three of them huddled together in the gathering darkness of his penthouse, one thing became crystal clear. The life they'd been building was about to be tested in ways none of them were prepared for. And this time, running wasn't going to be enough. The man who broke into Elliot's penthouse moved like a shadow with a purpose. It was 2:47 a.m. when the sound of splintering wood jolted Elliot from restless sleep. Not the clean break of an accident, but the deliberate crack of someone who knew exactly how to force a lock without triggering the building's main security system. Elliot's blood turned to ice. 3 doors down the hall, Lila and Benji were sleeping. He slipped from his bed, grabbed the baseball bat he'd kept behind his dresser since college, a relic from simpler times when his biggest worry was making the dean's list. His bare feet moved silently across the hardwood as he crept toward the living room. The intruder stood with his back to him, a mountain of a man silhouetted against the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Even in the darkness, Elliot could see the thick shoulders, the hands that looked like they could snap bones without effort. Marcus Webb. It had to be. Looking for something? Elliot's voice cut through the silence. The man turned slowly, and Elliot got his first look at the face that had been scratched out of that torn photograph. Square jaw, cold eyes, and a smile that belonged on something that hunted in the dark. Well, the knight in shining armor. Webb's voice was gravelly, like he'd spent years shouting over bar fights and engine noise. You've got something that belongs to me. I don't have anything of yours. Webb laughed, a sound devoid of humor. See, that's where you're wrong, rich boy. You've got my woman, my kid, my family. They're not your anything. Elliot gripped the bat tighter. And they never were. Is that what she told you? Webb took a step closer, and Elliot could smell the alcohol on his breath, see the wild look in his eyes that spoke of desperation and rage. Did she tell you how she used to beg me to come back? How she'd cry and promise to be better if I'd just give her another chance? Get out. Did she tell you about her sister? Sweet little Annie, still living in that same apartment in Denver? Webb's smile widened at the shock that crossed Elliot's face. Oh, she didn't mention her, did she? Didn't tell you that every time she runs, every time she tries to start over, I just have to make one phone call to remind her what happens to people who try to leave me. The bat trembled in Elliot's hands. You son of a... Daddy. The small voice from the hallway froze them both. Benji stood there in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes, looking confused and sleepy, and completely vulnerable. Webb's expression changed instantly, became something almost tender. Hey there, buddy. Remember Daddy? No. Lila's voice cracked like a whip as she appeared behind Benji, scooping him into her arms. But Elliot could see the terror in her eyes, the way her whole body shook as she faced the man who'd haunted her nightmares. He's not your daddy, baby. He's no one. Now that hurts, Lila. After everything we've been through together. Webb's voice was mockingly sweet. All those good times we had. All those lessons I taught you about respect. Get out. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of every nightmare, every bruise, every moment of fear she'd endured. Can't do that, sweetheart. You see, I've had some time to think while you've been playing house with Mr. Moneybags here. And I realized something. You're mine. You've always been mine. And it's time you came home. That's when Elliot struck. The bat connected with Webb's shoulder with a sickening crack. The big man roared and swung back, his fist catching Elliot in the ribs and sending him sprawling across his own coffee table. Call 911. Elliot gasped to Lila as Webb advanced on him. But Lila didn't move. She stood frozen, Benji crying in her arms, watching the man who'd terrorized her for years tower over the only person who'd ever made her feel safe. You think you can take what's mine? Webb grabbed Elliot by the shirt, hauling him to his feet. You think your money makes you tough? I think, Elliot said, tasting blood, that you're about to find out what happens when you threaten my family. The word hung in the air between them. Family. Not his house guests. Not his charity cases. His family. Webb's eyes narrowed. Your family? These are my. The sound of sirens cut through the night air, growing closer by the second. Webb's head snapped toward the windows. You called the cops. Building security, Elliot said, wiping blood from his mouth. Motion sensors in the hallway. They've been on their way since you broke down my door. For the first time since he'd appeared, Webb looked uncertain. The sirens were getting louder now, and the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the stairwell. "This isn't over," Webb snarled, backing toward the broken door. "You can't protect them forever. I know where they are now. I know about her job, about this place, about you. And I will get them back." He disappeared into the hallway just as the first police officers reached the penthouse level. Later, after the statements had been given and the reports filed, after Webb had vanished into the night like the predator he was, Elliot found himself alone in his study, staring at a wall safe he hadn't opened in 3 years. His hands shook as he entered the combination. Inside, beneath insurance documents and backup drives, lay a single envelope. Cream-colored paper, expensive, the kind used for important things. He pulled out the letter inside and unfolded it carefully, though he knew every word by heart. "Elliot, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I know you'll blame yourself, and I know you'll think there was something more you could have done. But this isn't your fault. You were building your empire, chasing your dreams, and I was so proud of you. I still am. But somewhere along the way, I started to feel like I was disappearing. Like I was just the sister of Elliot Dane, successful entrepreneur, instead of Sarah, the person. I called you 17 times last month. You returned 2 of those calls. I know you were busy. I know you had important meetings, important deals, important everything. But I was drowning, and I needed my big brother. I needed you to see me. I don't blame you for choosing your career over me. I blame myself for not being strong enough to save myself. But maybe if you just answered one more call. Maybe if you just come home one more time. I love you. I always will. And I hope someday you'll forgive yourself for being human. Your little sister, Sarah." Tears he'd held back for 3 years finally fell, landing on paper that had already been stained by too much grief. "Elliot." He looked up to find Lila in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "I heard you in here. Are you?" She stopped when she saw the letter in his hands. "What is that?" "My sister's suicide note." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Lila crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth but careful not to crowd him. "How long ago?" 3 years. She was 24. His voice cracked. "She needed me, and I was too busy building this empire to notice she was falling apart. That's not your fault, isn't it?" He looked at her with eyes full of pain. "I chose money over family, success over love, and she died because I wasn't there when she needed me most." Lila was quiet for a long moment, studying his face. "Is that why you gave me your keys that night? Because you couldn't save her, but you thought you could save me? Maybe. I don't know. All I know is that I can't fail another woman I care about." He met her eyes, and she saw the fierce determination there. "I won't let him hurt you or Benji. Whatever it takes." "He threatened Annie," she whispered. "My sister in Denver. If I don't go back to him, then we protect her too." "Elliot, you don't understand what you're up against. He has connections, people who owe him favors. He's not just some abusive boyfriend. He's dangerous in ways you can't imagine." Elliot folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the safe. When he turned to face her, there was something different in his expression. Something that spoke of resources and influence and the kind of power that money could buy when it was wielded by someone with nothing left to lose. "Then it's a good thing I'm dangerous too." The next morning, Elliot made 3 phone calls. The first was to Detective Maria Santos, a woman he'd met at charity functions who specialized in domestic violence cases. The second was to a private security firm that handled protection for Fortune 500 executives. The third was to his lawyer, a man who knew how to make problems disappear within the bounds of the law. By noon, Annie Chun was on a plane from Denver to New York, with 2 plainclothes officers ensuring she made it safely. By evening, Webb's parole officer had been notified of his violation, and warrants were being issued in 3 states. And by the time the sun set over the city that had witnessed so much pain and was about to witness something like redemption, Elliot Dane had made a decision that would either save the family he'd found or destroy everything he'd built. But as he watched Benji sleep peacefully in Lila's arms, as he saw the first glimpse of real hope in her honey-colored eyes, he knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were worth risking everything for. Some people were worth saving, even if it meant facing the darkness that had been chasing them. And sometimes, the only way to heal old wounds was to refuse to let new ones be inflicted on the people you loved. 6 months later, Elliot Dane stood before a crowd of reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers, holding a bronze plaque that would change everything. The building behind him was nothing like his sterile penthouse. It was warm brick and wide windows, with a garden where children could play and mothers could find a moment of peace. Above the main entrance, carved in simple, elegant letters, were the words, Sarah's Haven, a home for new beginnings. My sister Sarah died 3 years ago, Elliot said into the microphone, his voice steady despite the weight of the words. She died because she felt invisible, forgotten, like her struggles didn't matter to anyone. I failed her then. But today, we ensure that no woman facing crisis will ever feel that invisible again. In the crowd, Lila stood with Benji on her hip, tears streaming down her face as she watched the man who'd saved her life dedicate his future to saving others. Beside her, Annie Chun, safe now, protected, working as a teacher in a school that didn't know her story, squeezed her sister's hand. The trial had been swift. Webb's list of crimes, once investigators started digging, read like a catalog of everything wrong with the system that was supposed to protect women like Lila. Assault, stalking, violation of restraining orders, intimidation of witnesses. The evidence Elliot's team had gathered was overwhelming. Marcus Webb would spend the next 15 years in prison. And when he got out, if he got out, there would be people watching. People who understood that some predators never learned, and that some prey had grown claws. But that was behind them now. What lay ahead was something none of them had dared to dream about. The Sarah Dane Foundation will provide not just temporary shelter, Elliot continued, but comprehensive support, job training, childcare, legal assistance, and most importantly, a community of people who understand that starting over isn't just about finding a place to sleep. It's about finding a place to belong. He looked directly at Lila as he spoke, and she saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt every morning when she woke up in a world where she didn't have to be afraid. After the ceremony, after the reporters had gone and the crowd had dispersed, Elliot found himself in the kitchen of Sarah's Haven, watching Lila show a young mother how to use the computer lab. "Mama Lila, look." Benji ran up to him, now walking with the confident swagger of an almost 2-year-old, holding a drawing that might have been a house or a dinosaur or possibly both. "That's beautiful, buddy," Elliot said, scooping him up. Benji had started calling him Papa E about a month ago, and Elliot still felt his heart skip every time he heard it. "He's going to be an artist," Lila said, joining them. "Just like his." She stopped, the old fear flickering across her face for just a moment. "Just like his mama," Elliot finished gently, "who sees beauty everywhere and creates magic out of nothing." It was true. Over the past months, as Lila had thrown herself into running the foundation, her artistic side had emerged. The walls of Sarah's Haven were covered with her photography, portraits of the women they'd helped, moments of joy captured in the midst of struggle, images that told stories of resilience and hope. "There's something I want to show you," Elliot said, setting Benji down to chase after a volunteer who was pretending to be a monster. He led Lila to a small office off the main common room. Inside, on a simple wooden desk, sat a framed photo of Sarah and a small velvet box. Lila's breath caught. "Elliot, before you say anything," he said quickly, "I need you to know that this isn't gratitude. It's not guilt or some misguided attempt to save you. You saved yourself. You saved Benji. You saved me." He picked up the box and opened it, revealing a simple gold band with a single diamond that caught the afternoon light streaming through the window. "This is me asking you to build something with me. Not because you need protecting, but because I need you. Because Benji needs both of us. Because what we have is worth making official." Lila looked at the ring, then at the photo of Sarah, then at the window where they could see Benji playing with children whose mothers were learning to be unafraid. "You know what the funny thing is?" she said softly. "That night in the rain, when you gave me your keys, I thought you were crazy. Rich guy giving away his address to a complete stranger. I almost didn't use them. What changed your mind?" She smiled, the expression transforming her face into something radiant. "Benji." He looked at you like he knew you, like he'd been waiting for you his whole life. She paused. "Turns out we both had been. Is that a yes?" Instead of answering, she kissed him, soft and sure and full of all the tomorrows they were going to build together. "That's a yes," she whispered against his lips. 3 months later, on a rainy evening that mirrored the night they'd first met, Elliot and Lila were married in the garden of Sarah's Haven. Benji, dressed in a tiny tuxedo and carrying rings he was far too young to be trusted with, toddled down the aisle scattering flower petals and stealing everyone's hearts. As they exchanged vows under a canopy of lights and surrounded by the women whose lives they'd helped rebuild, a soft knock came at the garden gate. Everyone turned to see a young woman standing in the rain, holding a baby against her chest, looking scared and desperate, and exactly like Lila had looked 2 years ago. Lila's smile was gentle as she stepped away from her new husband and walked to the gate. "You're safe now," she said, opening it wide. "Come in. You're home." And as the wedding guests made room for one more, as Elliot watched his wife, welcome another lost soul into their sanctuary, as Benji clapped his hands in delight at the new baby, something settled in Elliot's chest that he hadn't felt since he was a child. Peace. Complete, unshakable peace. Later that night, after the last guest had gone home and the last dish had been washed, Elliot found himself on the fire escape of their new apartment above the foundation, looking out over the city lights with Benji asleep in his arms and Lila curled against his side. "Do you ever think about that night?" Lila asked quietly. "About what would have happened if you'd just walked past?" Elliot considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I remember something Sarah wrote in her letter. She said she hoped I'd forgive myself for being human. I think maybe the most human thing I ever did was stop walking. And the most human thing I ever did was trust a stranger. We're not strangers anymore." "No," Lila agreed, her hand finding his over Benji's sleeping form. "We're family." Above them, the first stars were appearing in the clearing sky. Below them, the lights of Sarah's haven glowed warm and welcoming, ready for whoever might need shelter from the storm. And in that moment, surrounded by love and purpose and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong, Elliot Dane understood something he'd spent his whole life searching for. Home wasn't a place you bought or built or inherited. Home was the people who chose to stay when staying was hard. Home was the family you found when you finally stopped running. Home was love made visible, hope made tangible, and the promise that no matter what storms might come, there would always be shelter waiting. As the city settled into sleep around them, three hearts beat in rhythm, and the story that had begun with keys given to a stranger in the rain found its perfect ending in the quiet promise of all the tomorrows they would share.